Let me introduce Frank Ruda. Frank is professor of philosophy at Dundee University in Scotland. He also teaches at the European Graduate School, and he's the co-editor of the journal Crisis and Critique. Frank's most recent books include Indifference and Repetition, which came out a couple of months ago, right? Reading Hegel, co-authored with Agon Hamza and Slavoj Žižek, published by Polity in 2022. Frank is also a translator of works by Badiou into German. The title of his presentation today is Up and the Ante, Psychoanalysis and the End of the Traversal of Philosophy.
Thank you very much, first of all, Lorenzo, and second of all, but not least of all, today for bringing me here. This is going to be experimental. Let's see. 2 quotations by Alain Badiou with mark the opening. Il n'y a pas une prédonnée. And the second one goes, Lacan's genius lay in seeing that if a truth cannot originate from its being given, it must be because it has its origin in a disappearance. In his 1990-91 seminar on the theory of evil and theory of love, Alain Badiou, and therein reminiscent of his 1989 Manifesto for Philosophy, diagnoses the contemporary state of philosophy to be defined by 4 problematic characteristics. First, philosophy is paralyzed by its own history. It is bogged down by what it has been, and metaphysics is the slightly disorientating shorthand for this very past. To overcome this paralysis, what is needed is un pas de plus, and one additional step, or forgive the pun, another not, N-O-T, an additional minus, one that, I quote, unbinds the bond that imprisons philosophy in its history, unquote. Second, philosophy must break with its own being historicist. It needs to become thetic, otherwise it cannot but derive from the givenness of its own history, the ruination of its own closure, its own end. We need, Badiou indicates, a form of active forgetting, a forgetting even of all the diagnoses of forgetting that populate the history of philosophy and move it forward to the domain of declarations. Third, philosophy must endorse the idea that one can define what it is, and one can do so rigorously and axiomatically, and it is this definition that is a historical invariant, in difference, for example, to those who pretend to be philosophers, notably the sophists, who also break with historicity and the grand narratives, but ultimately by endorsing an undoing of the very form of philosophy itself in problematic ways. Fourth, to maintain the difference between these 2 undoings of problematic historicism and thus to affirm the possibility of philosophy today, Badiou claims one must pass through the category of truth. For it is this category that allows for an overcoming of philosophy's own paralysis by its own endless self-deconstruction, its own not less endless self-historicization, and thereby free itself of the wrong kind of temporality, the, I quote, absoluteness of time, unquote, itself. It means to, quote again, give to the concept of truth its eternal dimension, unquote, and this ultimately necessitates for Badiou the proposal of, I quote, a modern thesis, an atheological thesis of eternity. There can be philosophy today if there can be a modern articulation of an eternity without God. But this is also a strong answer to an earlier question, notably one that he raised in an 83-84 seminar on the one Descartes, Plato, Kant, where he wondered if the history of philosophy, quite exceptional comment, has the status of a condition. And even in the early 1980s, but you strongly indicated that, I quote, I do not believe there are precursors, unquote. And that this assumption is part of what it means to methodologically, quote again, rehabilitate the unfounded and illegitimate, unquote. But what role then does the history of philosophy and the history of those disciplines of thought like psychoanalysis play that cannot entirely be absorbed into philosophy in its traditional form for Badiou? So where is history and philosophy? Where is it outside? I will argue in the following that the reinvention of philosophy that Badiou proposes must be read through two interlinked lenses. First, it must be situated within the precise conjuncture in the history of philosophy on the one hand side, and it can be properly understood if at the same time also being related to anti-philosophy. The anti-philosophical position that it is contemporary with, that being Lacanian psychoanalysis on the other hand. It is precisely Lacanian anti-philosophy that allows for a reinvention of philosophy, of which Badiou's position is the most direct expression, and this is the case because it allows for a different kind of undoing of the very form of philosophy. On the back of the particular form of the Heideggerian inner philosophical undoing of philosophy's history, and in contradistinction to the extra-philosophical, sophistic, politically disastrous undoing of philosophy as a result of its history. I will therefore argue that if located appropriately in the historical conjuncture and the effects it allows for, it is surprisingly exactly anti-philosophy which allows for a continual and for a reconstitution of philosophy by ending it in the right way. Even though the precise form in which this renovation takes place will unavoidably lead philosophy back to some of its conditions. But that there is a possibility of reaffirming philosophy by affirming its own condition is, in the last instance, to my mind, the productive distortion and undoing by anti-philosophy, whose effects are registered within philosophy through a historically specific transformation of its form. Philosophy's transformation is the only way in which philosophy, after a certain moment in its historical conjuncture and after a certain extra-philosophical, anti-philosophical transformation, can remain what it always was. I quote, a universal doctrine of the dialectic of being and event as doctrine of the subject. To validate this claim, I will first look at the historical conjuncture in which, I quote, the last universally recognizable philosopher, unquote, notably Martin Heidegger, establishes the deserted landscape in which Badiou's philosophical reinvention will have been made possible through Lacanian anti-philosophy. So Heidegger is the intra-philosophical and historically specific condition for the intervention of Lacanian psychoanalysis to become effective and registered in philosophy. In other words, it is precisely in times in which philosophy seems to be in crisis that anti-philosophy becomes a resource for its continuation and renewal. In this sense, I'm not interested in Badiou's critique of Lacan, or even if they're sustainable or not, we can talk about this, but that's not my main focus. But rather in the function Lacan, and more precisely anti-philosophy in its Lacanian guise, fulfills in Badiou's articulation of a reinvented Platonism. Anti-philosophy allows to traverse philosophy's fantasy of its own end, or what can appear to be its exhaustion. It will thus be that which allows it to go on in changed ways when it seems to have reached an end. That anti-philosophy is the non-conditional way of transforming philosophy means that there actually can be a reconciliation between the position that Badiou identified as a position of reconciliation, philosophy, and a position of war or of the irreconcilable, that is psychoanalysis. So between the position that ultimately aims at peace and reconciliation, the great Hegelian world, as I would like to add, and the other, this being psychoanalysis that emphasizes the irreconcilable and therefore war, and maybe because it is, as Badiou argued, prominently vis-à-vis Freud's invention in the century, because it came to be in a century that was essentially determined by war. It will have to be a mode of reconciliation with the irreconcilable. So I will examine the piecemeal that is shared between the position of peace and that of war in piecing together war and peace. This is not at all an attempt at unnecessary pacification. I rather would suggest that peace or reconciliation is a mode of working with war. Philosophy for Badiou of operating with psychoanalysis, and maybe we could say that it is a way of reconciling one with the irreconcilable, or to speak a language that Badiou repeatedly claimed unavoidable for the discussion of the relationship, if it is one, between psychoanalysis and philosophy. If psychoanalysis in its conceptual heights articulates what it can do through the affect of anxiety, then we learn to work with anxiety or move to courage with inciting it in the right dosages. to show that this is a possible way of reading what is going on, so we get anxiety and the superego, but I'm leaving this aside for other specialists, from post-Heideggerian psychoanalysis, and we put it to work from a certain point of view that Badiou names justice, and then we get to courage, is implicitly at stake in my reflections, but I leave the elaboration of this to Ray, who announced he will speak about these things. This will mean to argue that the Heideggerian condition reinscribes the poetic framing of pre-philosophical thought. Lacan interrupts the pre-philosophical suture with an at least twofold gesture that implies on the one hand side to emphasize the poetic pre-philosophical thought uses poetry as if it were mathematics, and to then interrupt the poetic suture by means of mathematics itself. After all these declarations, let me begin. The signifier that allows to enter Badiou's discussion of the last universally recognizable philosopher with whom closes, I quote, an entire epoch of thought and its concerns, unquote, is nihilism. What does the signifier amount to? It ultimately describes a result of what Heidegger addresses in terms of technique, which only uses resources and even knows being only as a resource, which it puts to work in a service du bien, a service du being, if I may say so, on a ground of a supposed subjectum that is the sujet supposé fondé, all that is. Philosophy diagnoses that nihilism manifests in measuring and measure technical production and administration of being as if it were an object, a being, or more precisely, a sum of beings in their totality, Sein des im Ganzen, and thus in its technological enframing, Gestell, whereby science becomes the suppression of existence under a technical will to power. There's a form of deracination from being by means of technique that leads to nihilistic consequences because the reign of technique does not have any specific aim but its own reproduction, which is why technique is not an instrument used for a purpose, but becomes its very own purpose. This deracination from being for Badiou indeed originated in Greek mathematics, wherein there is, I quote, an irreversible unleashing of the power of the letter, unquote, which ruptures previous forms of thought, but is misidentified by Heidegger because he problematically fuses the Greek and the Galilean moment and thinks that science, mathematics, the letter is technology. But for Badiou, I quote again, the theme is not technical nihilism, unquote. Yet, that the aletheia came under the yoke of the idea, as Heidegger's famous and harsh critique of Plato was epitomized, allows Heidegger nevertheless to read the history of capitalism and the history of literalization, as well as the history of rational argumentation as one and the same, and they're all linked to the history of philosophy. Nihilism, as a result of this, has 5 characteristics in Heidegger for Badiou. It implies an obscuration of the world against or versus the bright rational light of the Greek world, leads to a flight of the gods, to a destruction of the earth. This is why Badiou's Heidegger thinks that ecology is a German invention, to the unification of the masses of human beings, and to a desacralization of being, which is allowed for by the decoupling or unbinding of the letter from being itself. Badiou will basically say Heidegger misidentifies subtraction at that moment. All of them manifest in what Heidegger cannot but assume, namely in the uniform and unified history of philosophy that can be identified by its oblivious relationship to being. With this move, Heidegger allowed to forcefully endorse the claim that being qua being can actually be thought. He thereby made ontology again possible in a new way. But it's not philosophy for him that can actually do it, since philosophy did lose its soul when it lost being, and this is now the additional component of nihilism. That's my addition and not Badiou's. For philosophy also diagnoses in Heidegger a strange exhaustion of its own capacity to diagnose nihilism. Put differently, philosophy emphasizes that there is nihilism, and this diagnosis leaves everyone indifferent. And precisely, this is nihilism, the full actualization of nihilism. This is a particular point since philosophy now, for Badiou's Heidegger, can be identified with its own history. So different from its framing in Descartes, where philosophy and philosophical articulation break with and are in this sense independent from history, through Heidegger, and for Badiou the intermediary position here is that of Hegel, philosophy can now only be understood from its history. Philosophy here itself is no longer an illness, but maybe we could say a case a case study of how there is an unavoidable incapacity and incapacitation of philosophy due to philosophy's very own operativity, which can only be understood from the perspective of its history. And it is this very history that culminated in the absolute exhaustion of all potentials of its discursive continuation. We are not even, as in Heidegger, in Nietzsche, looking for a cure for philosophy. It is rather the case to diagnose its demise. The patience of the concept here means that the concept is dead. Philosophy has said all it can, and thus the form of its enunciation must change. For Heidegger, this is the move from philosophy to thought, from philosophy to denken. And it is not philosophers who think. In this sense, it is not only that science, the epitome of technology, does not think, also philosophy does not really think, at least since Plato. Now it is clear that for Badiou, Heidegger's critique of technology cannot but be identified as reactionary, even though he admits that some of Heidegger's readings of poets, on the other hand, are quite singular. But certainly, this is because his, I quote, anti-bourgeois radicalism, unquote, that ultimately leads him to assuming the position of a, quote again, feudal socialist, unquote, and with a dose of populist romanticism, another quote, was what in this very respect made him what Badiou calls a hyper-Nazi. So a Nazi for whom Hitler's Nazism did not go far enough, who thought that the remedy to nihilism, this is after late Heidegger's engagement, lies in poetry and poetry alone. When philosophy's discourse is exhausted and incapacitated, the hope lies in this case with the poets, with another form of discourse, with another form of saying it, that speaks differently because it can say it without ever saying it directly. Poets can speak indirectly. What the move to poetry is necessary, why that move to poetry is necessary, can for Badiou be derived from the post-Heideggerian state of philosophy that resulted from Heidegger's intervention. In short, after Heidegger's philosophy continuously assumed that it actually had ended, and not at all in the way in which Hegel seemed to have proclaimed so. For the symptoms of philosophy's exhaustion, of which Heidegger is an expression, underwriting Heidegger's diagnosis, manifest in the global state of philosophy, such that now philosophy on the one hand side becomes for Badiou identical to a renewed search of meaning of the given, to language analysis, or to a practice-orientated theory of the subject, a form of anthropology, or ultimately gives way to a resurgence of the sophistic assumption that the epitome of freedom can only be found in language. Freedom is then the freedom to say it all of it inconsistently at once, simply because it does not matter anyhow. So for Badiou, hermeneutics, analytic philosophy, philosophical anthropology, and postmodernism are the defining features of the contemporary state of philosophy post-Heidegger. They're all not only, I quote, too compatible with the world, unquote, as bad forms of its reproduction qua representation, they also share the assumption that language is the transcendental horizon of thought. But this is not the only problematic effect that Heidegger's intervention generated. For Heidegger produced in Badiou's account, as you certainly know, a series of sutures. I quote Badiou, "The modern blockage of philosophy is suture," unquote. Suture means, as you will know, the philosophical assumption that it's not philosophy, but only one of philosophy's conditions that can think it's time, or time. So philosophy becomes suture to science and turns positivism, or again becomes anthropology, or is suture to politics, for example in Marxism, where it actually is suture to two extra philosophical discourses, namely to science and politics, at the same time under the aegis of politics. The reason for this account, the suture became dominant at the same time when there was the Heideggerian proclamation of an end of philosophy, has to do with the fact that Heidegger actually did not only diagnose that philosophy is dead and a rotting corpse. This is the reason as to why only a God can save us, as only a God can resurrect those who are not alive anymore, and even though this God has to come to being herself in the first place, but he also made an influential proposal for what to do with the corpse now. And this proposal led him to a specific form of suture, a suture of philosophy to poetry, which ultimately was an attempt to undo not only philosophy, but the history of philosophy since Plato. So suturing philosophy, and in Heidegger's case to poetry, was in Badiou's reading the conceptual consequence of philosophy's historical demise and exhaustion. Suturing became a means of undoing the dead. Undoing the dead was, in this case, also inspired by what Badiou called, I quote, a desire for the obscure, unquote. And the obscure was precisely attainable as an effect of such suturing operation to poetry, not saying it directly anymore. So because Heidegger saw in suturing a means of undoing philosophy, and because philosophy is its history, Heidegger's project is the undoing of the history of philosophy, and he sutured philosophy to the form of thought that historically preceded any philosophy that stands under the condition of science, and more explicitly under that of mathematics. This is to say, Heidegger undid philosophy by suturing it to the form of pre-philosophical, and this means pre-Socratic thought. This suture impacted the entire post-Heideggerian philosophical situation as it became sutured in so many different ways. So suture became a thing. Right? But Heidegger's suturing was a particular one, for it did not mean to create a poetic philosophy. Rather, it meant to end the incapacitation of philosophy by undoing it and by assigning its previous task to the poets of thinking, being, qua being. This is the gesture that became the constitutive and defining feature of what Badiou terms the age of poets, since it is poetry that now can do what philosophy cannot any longer, because it isn't any longer. Thought today, for Heidegger, in Badiou's reconstruction, is reserved to the poets. Dichtend, denken, thinking poetically, is now what replaces philosophy. This is the consequence of the Heideggerian undoing of philosophy when the latter had historically reached what Robert Pippin recently called its culmination, and what for Badiou's Heidegger appears as its end. For Heidegger, philosophy was exhausted, thereby came to an end, and then he executed the end by turning back the clock. He unended the end of philosophy and began anew, but not with philosophy, rather with a poetic form of thought. Heidegger performed an undoing of philosophy, and this undoing is identical to the act of suturing philosophy to the poetic form of discourse. This gesture was so successful that the last universally recognized philosopher returned to the pre-Platonic state of philosophy. He made philosophy productively regress to its own prehistory. But thereby, Heidegger, different from the discursive effects this had, actually created the preconditions for a renewal and a continuation of philosophy. And this has to do with what the suturing of philosophy to poetry was attempting to achieve, namely the undoing of what constitutes the scientific, in the Heideggerian understanding, kernel of philosophy, namely its claim to objectivity. Because it's precisely an effect of technology that it produces and relies on objectivity, that the category of the object is the main guarantor of meaning, Badiou says, whereas Heidegger's poets, that is those who he claims are already pre-Socratic in times that he considers to be Platonic, debunk and suspend the category of the object. It's an objectless discourse that he locates there. But you see thinking of the poetic period from Hölderlin through Rimbaud, Mallarmé, Trakl, Pessoa up to Celan. Poetic thought undoes objectivity and undoes the condition of thought that thought needs an objective framing or makes a claim to objectivity. This does not turn it into a simple form of subjective expression, rather into something inobjective. It enables to think that thinking can be conditioned by something that is not an object, and this means that even the objective ground layer, the subjectum of modern thought, could be undone. This was Heidegger's attempt in Badiou's reading to again become pre-Socratic, to locate the disjunction of thought from any object and thereby from the technological framing of science in poetic thought. It is possible, this is what Badiou considers Heidegger's great achievement, to think being qua being in a form of discourse that does not objectify. It is the form of this discourse which therefore becomes relevant. It is a form that does not objectify, and this is therefore the form of, let's say, the discursive event as an event is not a thing, not even a no thing, but something that takes place, that happens. So the form of the poetic discourse is the form of the event itself. Poetic thought can therefore register that which being is for Heidegger, an event, a donation. But therefore, the poetic form, as Badiou once put it, enables us to think that our account of being originated in an event, even though Heidegger thinks that it is an event of being. So that's the difference that he will make, right? For Heidegger, being is evental itself, whereas Badiou will insist that we need an event so that we can formalize or articulate being. That was a fusion. Badiou stated, the poem founds being in speech and is not an expression of it. It founds being in speech, and it's not an expression of it. And hence we get here, in Heidegger's understanding, a finally objectless discourse of being qua being. We return from the modern framework determined by the Cartesian form of subjectivity to a pre-modern Greek way of thinking without a subject and an object. But you will also continue to defend the claim that poetry produces truths, as you all know, because it is objectless. It offers a, quote, doctrine of the events, unquote, because each poem is, quote again, an evental name, unquote. But he will differ from Heidegger in the assumption that being itself is evental. Rather, it will be that being can be thought on the basis of events in the discourse on being, with the first event being the invention of this discourse itself. But with Heidegger, the poets become our pre-Socratics, and well, Heidegger becomes, as an effect of this alter-modern and alter-Platonic counter-historical undoing, de facto, I quote Badiou, a new Parmenides. He is thus successful with what he aimed at, even though Heidegger untenably assumed that the history of philosophy is as unified as he presents it. The making philosophy pre-Socratic again, maybe one of the first make whatever country or practice great again moves in the 20th century that was quite successful, then in consequence allows for Badiou for a novel Plato. But Heidegger is not aiming to go down that route at all. He does not want to make this un pas de plus from the new Parmenides to a new Plato. To enable the step, one must, I quote Badiou, desuture Heidegger, unquote. And this cannot be done by means of another twist in Heidegger's deconstruction. It can also not be done by means of poetry alone. Rather, what Badiou in 87, 88 proclaimed as, quote, the end of the age of poets, unquote, a provisory name, he calls this, a provisory name, must lead to a break with the poetic suturing, to a break that must refeed philosophy's first foundation, and this first foundation was a rupture of the suturing of thought to poetic form by means of the mytheme. The big letter is turned small, he says. So poetry is written in capital letters. It is here to my mind that Lacan plays the crucial role that he plays for Badiou. Since if, I quote, philosophy has been born under the condition of the mytheme, unquote, then it is precisely the emphasis on the mytheme under Heideggerian conditions that repeats philosophy's birth, and that is how philosophy, Badiou's philosophy registers Lacan's anti-philosophical act. It is Lacanian anti-philosophy, emphasizing the mytheme against philosophy, which allows to continue philosophy after Heidegger. And the mytheme sits then where an impasse of formalization is formalized, or as meta-ontological mytheme, where this happens vis-à-vis ontology. Un pas de plus, another step in the sense, is a step that had already been taken once, but never in this way. It is a novelty through and in the mode of repetition, and this is what Lacan and only Lacanian anti-philosophy allows for. And therein it is distinguished from Nietzsche, Rousseau, Kierkegaard, Paul, or Wittgenstein. For Lacan, who translated Heidegger's Logos text into French, is for Badiou, and despite all the often harsh criticism, the thinker who actually enabled a contemporary philosophy by performing a torsion on the post-Heideggerian suture conjuncture of philosophy. Not only did Badiou declare twice already that a modern philosophy is only possible, that is as strong as the claim is, if it is, quote, able to withstand the challenge of Lacan, unquote, and that everyone owes to Lacan not only the defense of the Cartesian subject under post-Heideggerian conditions, this is what Badiou calls, I quote, a countercurrent that is heroic, unquote, but he also repeatedly emphasized that Lacan asserted that for him, the whole history of philosophy has been Parmenidean. Badiou likes to cite the following claim, namely that, I quote, the supposition that being itself thinks is what founds the philosophical tradition from Parmenides onwards, unquote. The philosophical tradition can be unified through the thesis that being thinks, Parmenides is thus what unifies philosophy. The reason for this is the famous Parmenidean claim that it's the same to think and to be. And I would just like to add as a side note that Hegel might be here an interesting exception, since he famously declared that there is not one sentence of Heraclitus that I would not have integrated into my logic, emphasizing that there is a clear Heraclitean streak in modern philosophy. We thus move in this account from Parmenides to the new Parmenides, Heidegger, and being is still assumed to think. We move from Parmenides through Plato, Descartes, Hegel, Nietzsche to Heidegger, and the latter is so successful in his endeavor that we seem to have not moved at all. In this sense, one could say that Lacan thus allows to actually see that philosophy has moved from Parmenides to the new Parmenides without ever properly reaching Plato, even though this is rather one way maybe of understanding Badiou's rendering. We're stuck with Parmenides. With Heidegger's undoing of philosophy and his effective transformation of philosophy into thought, Lacanian anti-philosophy now enters the scene, and this is why there is no modern philosophy without Lacan. Lacan negated what no longer existed, namely philosophy. With Lacan, we can thus make another knot, NOT. After Heidegger, there is no philosophy but thought, but then there's anti-philosophy, and this is how we actually can start to get moving again on the side of philosophy. Moving what is not there, a non-being. I'm here mainly interested in how precisely the Lacanian negation of the result of the Heideggerian pre-philosophical condition allows, on the one hand side, to actually continue philosophy after Heidegger, because it allows for the desuturing of philosophy from poetry, and thereby allows to repeat the initial founding act of philosophy in a novel manner. Psychoanalysis allows for an end of the end of philosophy, and to see in it a precondition for its continuation. On the other hand, this will shed light on what Badiou calls peace treaty, unquote, between philosophy and psychoanalysis, since Lacanian psychoanalysis in its function allows, by being anti, to bring back to life that which is no longer there, philosophy, by negating that which is not, and that which is not for Heidegger was that thing that had a subjectum, as a subject in its center. This is why it makes it possible to conceive of an entirely new concatenation of the, I quote, fundamental knot of being, non-being, and thought, unquote, for a repetition of Plato, and this means Lacan allows for a repetition of the parricide which Plato commits in the Sophistes of Parmenides, even of the new one. Lacan allows to kill Heidegger, that's the short version, decapitate and desuture him at the same time. How? By emphasizing the theme, and also that love originates in an encounter. And if Badiou, as he does in Being an Event, will suggest that the hitherto history of philosophy has remained within the first half of Plato's Parmenides dialogue, debating with great refinement the intricacies of the assumption that the one is, it is actually Lacanian anti-philosophy that allows to pass onto its second half by allowing for the move, as we all know, from the one to il y a de l'un, and by allowing to take another step, and for Badiou that is a step towards the Platonism of the multiple. The second half of the Parmenides can finally be read. Lacan, as Badiou insisted in another place, is he who, I quote, completes contemporary anti-philosophy or represents its highest form. Not because Lacan formulates the most anti-philosophical of all anti-philosophies, but rather because Lacan repeatedly proved that psychoanalysis is essentially incomplete, or put differently, it is a practice which from now on provides a conceptual resource for transforming philosophy that is at the same time not identical to its conditions. Because is what forces not an articulation of a concept of truth, that's not a difference to the condition, but what forces philosophy to re-articulate its theory of the subject. If philosophy can never get rid of the sophists, it can at least, I quote a chapter title of Badiou's hyper-translation of Plato's Republic, it can at least reduce them to silence. With Lacan, who, and Badiou agrees with this, related to Freud as Leninist to Marx, and therefore repeatedly refer to him as the Lenin of psychoanalysis, we had that already. With Lacan and Lacanian anti-philosophy, philosophy now has to learn to listen. This shows that psychoanalysis has from now on, and there it's similar, I think, in Badiou to Marxism, which, let's not forget, is also an anti-philosophy for Badiou, and this is to say forever, clarified that anti-philosophy is what forces philosophy to rethink periodizingly its theory of the subject and what that subject is composed of. But you will basically say his subject is composed of 4 infinities that are anxiety, the superego, courage, and justice. So this is what the field of practice that philosophy cannot but engage with allows for. And this is especially the case as it is demanding and sometimes even hostile to it. In my reading, this is because with Lacan, psychoanalysis will be an anti-philosophy which will work within philosophy for philosophy's renewal, reinvention, by splitting its history into two in a more fundamental manner than Nietzsche was able to do for Badiou, because with Marx and Freud and Lenin and Lacan, we are, I cite Being and Event, the contemporaries of a second epoch of the doctrine of the subject. It is no longer the founding subject. The subject is void, cleaved, asubstantial, and irreflexive. So all four names are part of that second epoch. So what comes from anti-philosophy is a historicization of the conception of the subject, which in Badiou finds its place between the undecidability of the event on the one hand side and the indiscernibility of truth on the other. But this place it could only find because anti-philosophy forced philosophy to think subjectivity anew after Heidegger. The force of this transformation is different from the mode in which the conditions force philosophy to think truth anew, because the conditions demand philosophy to formalize a contemporary space of compossibility for the truth established eventually in its conditions, whereas with the impact from anti-philosophy on philosophy, what is forced is a new symbolic organization of philosophy, because it allows to conceive of the being of non-being as taking place in, I quote, the pure existence which determines the being of the subject, unquote, and thereby enables us to think of, quote, the not of being subject and truth anew, unquote. Thereby it transforms philosophical symbolic formatting. Just as a side note, this goes as far as Badiou thinking that the seminar is now part of philosophy. The seminar, I quote, a genre to which Lacan has given a definitive dignity. So that's the most trivial indication, right? In other words, after and with Heidegger, philosophy admitted its own incapacity. Lacan elevated this incapacity to a point of impossibility for Badiou, where it becomes clear how to end the end of philosophy by traversing it and establishing the coordinates for a renewed continuation. He allowed for a new symbolic framing of philosophy itself, for a Platonism for today for Badiou, and Heidegger sought to undo philosophy and bring it back to pre-philosophical poetic thought. Lacan undoes Heidegger's undoing for Badiou in such a way that he does not cure philosophy from its metaphysical illness, rather he cures the incapacity that it brought about, again, from its own metaphysics. He makes it worse, in other words, but that's the right thing to do. He allows to cure the way in which it was cured from its problematic metaphysics and introduces what Badiou calls, I quote, a subtractive metaphysics, ascribed to Lacan, against the hypostatization of the one as and of being in Heidegger. This is to say that for Heidegger, metaphysics forgot being in terms of physis, whereas for Badiou's Lacan, I quote, metaphysics is the possibility to think non-physics, unquote. That which is neither one nor being. In this sense, and this is verbatim Badiou, to conceive of pure multiplicity is Lacanian. It's in the Lacan seminar. I was quite surprised to read that. The Heideggerian diagnosis of and the Heideggerian reinstatement of the incapacitation of philosophy was elevated to a point of impossibility, notably to think through what seemed to be impossible, that the inconsistent multiple derived from the meaningless name of being is what there is, that there is no being unless it is named, and that the meaningless name is the result of an event that took place in the discourse on being, which therefore can be thought to be situated outside of philosophy in the practice of formalization that operates with the metheme, formalizing the impasses of formalization. That was a dense sentence, I know, but I think it's correct. In other words, it allowed to think through the assumption that there is no there is, and that on the basis of this assumption to think through the Platonic consequences that the reason that there is must be because something has happened that has been named. This is the undoing of Heidegger's undoing, the creation of the possibility of a renewal of philosophy out of the end of the nothing of philosophy. Which is why for Badiou, Lacan's only imperative is dissolve. He says that, also in the Lacan seminar, dissolve. That means dissipate, disband, unbind. But using philosophy and Lacanian psychoanalysis share that thought thinks under the condition or in the mode of de-liaison, of unbinding. And this is why the metheme is the form of the unbinding, if I may use this seemingly contradictory expression. Lacan unbinds essentially the post-Heideggerian condition by interrupting it with the metheme and with the reinvention of the thought of love, the first since Plato, he says. This is to my mind why Badiou can state that philosophy and psychoanalysis share what he calls two common borders, the metheme and love. The metheme is the mode in which the latter, that is unbound from reference and sense, allows to transmit and thus allows for the knowledge of a truth that cannot be known, as it does not transmit any content and there is nothing to know. And this is what Badiou thinks the whole paradox of the unconscious is about. And love is what allows, as Badiou cites Lacan, to approach being as such in an encounter, unquote. With Lacan, in other words, philosophy can learn how to move into the direction of a subtractive metaphysics by means of which it becomes able to take the next step en pas de plus from the first half of the Parmenides dialogue to the second. Right? Because the multiples then become multiples of nothing, and that's the one thing that even Plato could not imagine. For anti-philosophers, on the one hand side, always, for Badiou, relate anything universal to a form of experience of a subject, thus to a form of singularity, but they are also, I quote him, very useful for philosophy, unquote, and this not only because they articulate contemporary objections, and philosophy only speaks, he says, in the form of objections and declarations, so there is nothing else than this. So philosophy, even in its mode of articulation, has an anti-philosophical side, because we must learn from them about the form of universality. That was Badiou. We must learn from them about the form of universality. So universality is anti-philosophical. This is why the first anti-philosopher was Paul. So even though psychoanalysis is not about education, as Badiou has repeatedly emphasized, philosophy is forced to learn from it, something is passed on. How does philosophy learn? There are a number of answers that Badiou gives, and all of them are important for the peace treaty picture I'm drawing. Lacan complicates for Badiou already the neo-Parmenidean condition, and here Badiou's assignation of Lacan's discourse as being amphibological is not only crucial, as it indicates that now all anti-philosophical statements can be read in undecidedly two ways at the same time, but it finds its potential origin, the subtractive pantheism Mladen put forward on Tuesday, in Lacan's engagement and reading of Parmenides. But you indicated in his text on Lacan, the Pre-Socratics, that Lacan assumes that the Parmenidean form of pre-Socratic poetry, especially because it co-originated with mathematics as demonstrative discipline, can be read in two ways, namely as poetry or as a poetic form of formalization as proto-matheme, which is why for Badiou Parmenides presents the first apagogical proof of a reductio ad absurdum in poetic language, and this is why Parmenides actually broke for Lacan with the mythic tradition preceding him. So Lacan splits the Parmenidean discourse into a hardly decipherable two, indicating that its amphibological undecidability might be the indication of the fact that philosophy needs to think undecidability, notably an event that is not being as event. This has an impact on the ontology, or to pun with Mladen again, sorry, I'm exploiting you a bit, the pantology of the letter. But Lacan also split the pre-philosophical condition into two, because against Parmenides' ontology of the one, he endorses what Badiou calls the, I quote, primacy of discord, unquote, which is the position of Heraclitus, who allows us to think the, I quote, non-relation's chronological priority over relation. Let me say that again. It allows us to think the non-relation's chronological priority over relation. So for Badiou's Lacan, who was, I quote, a great thinker of disorder, unquote, as much as for Badiou's Heidegger, something has been forgotten or lost between the pre-Socratics and Plato. It is not, however, the meaning of being, it is rather the meaning of non-relation, the existence of non-relation, of the first separation or gap. It is here that Lacan, for Badiou, does not only interrupt post-Heideggerian and in the sense pre-Platonic thought, and I'm now saying pre-Platonic, as Lacan also sides with Socrates against Plato for Badiou, but also provides an access to what Badiou calls the pre-Socratic genealogy of psychoanalysis. So he allows to historicize anti-philosophy. Right. It is in this sense that Lacan completes anti-philosophy by traversing philosophy's fantasy of its own end, by ending its end by means of displacing its beginning, from Parmenides to Heraclitus, In Seminar 20, Lacan says Parmenides was wrong and Heraclitus was right. Philosophy and anti-philosophy now rendered for Badiou's Lacan as the history, the dialectical historicity of anti-philosophy. He is praised for being able, I quote, to formalize the internal dialectics of anti-philosophy. So this is what only Lacan can do. We could say, he can say how we get from Paul to Lacan. But this is the case because this allows us to also historicize philosophy, to give it a renewed form, making new holes in it, to speak with Mohammed. I want to end a bit abruptly, but in a way that might connect well with Ray's later paper, with a potential answer to the question that I put to myself, so we're already started the Q&A, don't worry, with why Badiou repeatedly ends his text on psychoanalytic anti-philosophy with a call for courage. The courage, I quote again, to accomplish one more step. To me, it seems to be the case because Heidegger actually provided the condition of nihilism with his most radical expression in philosophy by ending philosophy. This is why what Heidegger in Being and Time already called the courage to be anxious, but actually thereby he shook up the foundations of philosophy only to discover a more profound one. Then Lacan radicalized this foundation by unbinding, by voiding it again, and further, the subjective name of this for Badiou is anxiety, but he also pointed to more than just anxiety, and that's part of his amphibological structure, notably when he stated in 73, love can only actualize what in a sort of poetic flight in order to make myself understood I called courage. And when in 1954, Badiou particularly likes this quote, Lacan asked if we have to extend analytical intervention as far as the fundamental dialogues of justice and courage, unquote. Badiou's philosophy in his self-understanding is to my mind following the Lacanian dictate and directive. It attempts to take another subtractive step, un pas de plus, by finding the courage to continue after the end, the courage to continue even though the end already happened. But here, what comes to the fore is also the history of anti-philosophy itself. For Badiou at one point claimed, and there's something puzzling in this, and because it puzzled me, I wanted to put it here and see how bad it can go. For Badiou at one point claimed that the late Lacan was similar to Oedipus at Colonus, notably an old man who dies and disappears, but does this so slowly that he becomes increasingly erratic. So can there also be an exhaustion of anti-philosophy? I mean, if that statement is anything but only polemical, that is what that means. However one answers this question, and this is the question of the history of anti-philosophy, right? A difficult one, I find. The courage to face anxiety proper allows to take another step, take it a knot further. It is the courage to work with and through anti-philosophy, especially because it provokes. It is where philosophy's anxiety comes from, and it is thus the guide to a novel reconciliation. Badiou says in the seminar on Lacan, La philosophie en avant-garde, c'est l'anti-philosophie. To follow this garde en avant, this guide means to organize a peace treaty between the two practices of true unbinding that unbind together a new subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. We can open the Q&A session. We have 15 minutes or so.
Frank, thank you. Excellent paper. And agreed with many of your assessments, in particular of the string Heidegger, Lacan, Badiou. An underestimated point, I think, that we were talking about last time. But I just want to focus on one phrase you said, which I think is symptomatic of some of, or at least my disagreements with even Badiou's assessment, and where Lacan might actually provide the key, and that is 3 words: science, specifically mathematics. Just that. Because if I get you right, I mean, to use like even a phrase that Slavoj, invented some time ago, Heidegger made the right step in the wrong direction. For me, this in the wrong direction, as you say, right, is poetry. Instead of what? Instead of a suture to well, he thinks instead of a suture to science insofar as it would become techne through matem. But the precise point is that matem is not proper to science. You know, there's a difference between a formalism and a formalization as much as there's a difference between a technical practical versus, you know, some theoretical or moral, right? So I put to you, whereas I think Lacan was very explicit about this. I mean, I think the first time is around 1969, like Préface à une thèse, where he's saying it's impossible actually to transmit psychoanalysis within the university but then actually you need to use a proper matem in order to do this, not like what Leclerc and Laplanche do. Anyway, but so I put it to you, how do you break down this issue of, because I think it's unclear in Badiou, how do you break down science and matem?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I wanted to suggest a two-step process. First, the matem is brought in as what desutures, right, Heidegger. And what does that mean? To do something with the in-objective discourse that he has established and that we need as form of ontology, but by rupturing not only the link that philosophy has with poetry or poetry has with ontology, but also at the same time between the link between the letter and sense. That is what the matem does, right? So it intervenes twice. And on that basis, when philosophy's identification of poetry with ontology is separated from ontology, and a different ontology of the letter, a different meta-ontological account of the letter is established, but you can say something, this is why mathematics can establish the truth of the real of being. Right? But that, I did not go through the steps because I was more interested in what precisely does Lacan allow for. But that is how I would say Badiou then proceeds. Right? He desutures poetry and ontology. They're just two different conditions. Right?
Doesn't one mean to desuture Lacan's from science?
No, I don't. No, I mean, I was trying to say no, because there is a twofold function of the matem then for Badiou, and I mean that is what I mentioned when I said it fulfills an ontological function, and that is why ontology becomes mathematics as science, but it also fulfills a meta-ontological function, namely is actually articulated in the theory of the event. Right.
Thank you, Frank. Beautiful as always. I mean, there are a lot of things I would like to sleep on first, because there are many interesting points here. Just a comment and then a question, perhaps. I mean, it's an interesting thing. I don't know. I think that it is Badiou's formulation that Heidegger is last universally recognized philosopher. This is an interesting point from somebody who's not a philosopher of consensus. Badiou is certainly not a philosopher of consensus, and I somehow ask myself, why does he need that? And furthermore, this is wrong, because Heidegger is not last recognized philosopher. You know the famous dispute about his lecture, Was ist Metaphysik, and Carnap and Schlick, etc., das nicht, nichts, etc., this is nonsense, etc. So you cannot speak about universally recognized philosopher at all. But you somehow needs this point. This is just a comment. It's just a comment. It's not a question. It's an interesting thing that in First Manifest, which is published in 1988, Badiou is somehow optimistic towards the tendency of capitalism to, you know, all that is solid melts into air. And this is somehow a point against Heideggerians, in a way, against privileging, you know, authenticity, obscurantism, etc. Just another comment. And then a question. You mentioned in this context, it is interesting that you a sentence you mentioned, and I would like you to elaborate if you have to say something more about it, because you mentioned that philosophy lost its soul, and I somehow didn't get the context. The context. Who says that? If this is your thesis, etc. Can you elaborate, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thesis, he says it's the last universally recognized philosopher because he thinks this is why I talked about the contemporary state of philosophy, according to his account. That's from the text in Infinite Thought, but one finds something similar in the first manifesto, that contemporary philosophy, this contemporary philosophical situation is determined by three philosophical branches, basically. Deconstruction, well, Heidegger's reference is clear there. Hermeneutics, again, the same. And, well, positivism, in some sense, and that comes out of an engagement with Heidegger, he thinks, at critical distance. So he has the idea that Carnap, the meeting in the mountains, and so forth, is actually what determines that kind of radicalization.
I forgot to say that there is a scale club, Kant. Kant is universally recognized. So they could be interesting.
Yeah. It's also. I mean, I think he says Heidegger there because you get so even in analytic departments, you can talk about the early Heidegger, right? Pragmatism, right? I mean, they don't have a problem with that. McDowell can live with that somehow. He's not analytic, and he would not endorse it. But it's not. I mean, it's not like when they open up a Hegel book and all think, what the hell is that, right? I mean, for a long period of time, or when someone reads nowadays, I don't know, Derrida or Lacan, right? They would basically say that is not something we should engage with, but early Heidegger's sort of okay, right? So I think this is why Badiou makes that claim. So he is recognized throughout all these different camps, even though they don't disagree on, I don't know, an endorsement of Heidegger or whatsoever. I think that's the first. The philosophy lost its soul point, that was a bad joke, because I said it lost its soul because it lost being, sort of, or forgot about being. So, right, it lost sort of its essence in some sense, or what it, right, I mean, that is where I wanted to take that. And the second comment I didn't really get, I think, that you made.
It's not important.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Frank. That was a really rich talk, a lot of layered things to think about. Just a comment more than a question. I was just thinking about desuturing and a sort of movement from desuturing to unbinding.
Yeah.
And even though, of course, this is controversial in the final Lacan, there is, in 1975, when he gave that first talk on Joyce, the Santom, he did make a claim which he never quite repeated in Seminar 23, that Joyce unsubscribes himself from the unconscious. Désabonner was the word, if I remember correctly. So again, I mean, and at least one way in which the final teaching has been read, again, and that's the controversy, I suppose, is that it's a sort of post-psychoanalytic vision of psychoanalysis, where in Seminar 24, unconscious itself is almost a semblant. Unconscious itself is a deduction. It's almost a hypothesis, as it were, that you induce through the process of analysis.
Yeah.
And you construct the unconscious, as it were, through the process of analysis. And would that somehow relate to that point about exhaustion? And as far as I remember, Badiou makes that point vis-a-vis the absolutely final fragmented seminars, the topology and time sessions where Lacan is confused, drawing the knot, makes mistakes, gives it up, that I'm done for the day or something like that. And there is a sort of poetic way in which Badiou sees that as the disappearing subject of Oedipus at Colonus. But I'm wondering whether unbinding and exhaustion would somehow work together, and whether this unsubscription from the unconscious, or at least unsubscription from a certain kind of unconscious, could be seen as a sort of horizon for some unend of psychoanalysis. I don't know.
No, thank you. I think it's a very, very good and very difficult question. On the first layer of an answer would be, so Badiou says that what Lacanian antiphilosophy and his philosophy share, that thinking is unbinding and right? Because he wants to say it is the most radical form of conceiving of déliaison, right? And he has given, I think, in 83, a very short definition of what thought is. Thinking is to délier, right? That's the only thing that it does. This is why, right, it's subtractive. Now, in a practice that itself becomes unbinds all forms of unbinding. And I think the periodization that Badiou gives now and then of what Lacan does can be understood in these forms of unbinding. He was, I mean, literally, he says he was the first to periodize himself. I mean, it's an insane thing to say, right? Because he just reshuffled his entire form of thought. And one can even think maybe he did it twice, right? I mean, it's, right? So in this sense, there is really, that is inherent in his practice. Now, it becomes immediately, and Mladen has written an absolutely wonderful paper on this, politically quite scary if even a practice of unbinding, even the forms of unbindings can be exhausted. Because what does that mean politically? Right? And then we're really in a mess, I'd say. Right. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, that relates to what I wanted to ask you, and it's a very naive question, but I think what you said about philosophy with Badiou, it relates well to what Mohammed, I think, obviously said about traversing the fantasy in analysis. Yeah. And my question was really naively, how do we translate this to politics? I mean, what does it mean to give up or traversing fantasy in political sense, relating maybe to what Peter said about bad purity, as he called it?
Thank you. I mean, that is where... So what is really, really interesting, and I have thoughts on the second half, not on the first, so I'm going to say the thing which I find difficult, and then I'm going to speak about the thing that I find slightly less difficult. Hegel has two anti-philosophers. He's the only one who has two, Kierkegaard and Marx, in Badiou, right? And that's interesting for a number of reasons. Because Marx's anti-philosopher is also linked to the condition of politics and to, well, a certain episode in the formulation of the hypothesis of emancipation, right? That is absolutely clear. He clearly says that. So Marxism is a way of articulating the hypothesis of emancipation that can be then, from Marx's perspective onwards, right, he does the communist hypothesis stages and all that, but it can be even identified in Spartacus, right? So it allows from there a new legibility of politics, I would say, right? That is what Marx really allows. Now, there is and this is why I emphasize so much that anti-philosophy is able to transform philosophy for Badiou in a way that the conditions cannot, because Badiou had a very tricky debate with his old former friend, and now not even frenemy, but just enemy, Sylvain Lazarus, who basically, I'm boiling this down massively, said Marxism is a transcendental condition of your thought. And if that is the case, you don't historicize that, right? That would be a suture of philosophy to Marxism as transcendental condition. I think he avoids that. I think he avoids that by saying, already in 85, Peut on penser la politique, we have to rewrite the manifesto. So Marxism is itself sort of exhausted. We just have to rewrite it anew. The form and what is articulated there, emancipation, is an absolute eternal component of politics, absolutely. It never changes. Marx made us see that. This is why we can see it even in the political past. But Marxism isn't. Right? So only insofar as Marx is linked to the name of the discovery of a certain form of articulated emancipation. The history of Marxism is the attempt of course, thinking through this and so forth. Now, but he speaks on the one hand side in relation to the condition of politics about the communist hypothesis. So there's a hypothesis of emancipation, and Marxism is part of that history, of that hypothesis. But he speaks, when he speaks from the perspective of meta-politics, of a communist idea. And what a communist idea is has a different status, I think, as an orientation than the communist hypothesis, which allows to periodize or historicize the condition of politics. So what I'm trying to say is, Marxism allows to historicize the history of what Badiou calls communist invariants that show themselves in politics in different organizational formats, as articulation of the history of the communist hypothesis that tries to articulate something that philosophy would articulate in terms of a communist idea. Why does it have a communist idea in the first place? Because of anti-philosophy, that is Marxism. You see what I'm trying to say? So the way in which philosophy itself relates to politics and looks at it and sees that which components of it are absolute invariants is what Marxism allows. Philosophy itself can't do that. Pre-Marx, it would have done it differently. Let me put it like that. Hopefully that makes sense.
We have time for one final question.
Thank you for last lousy question. I suppose I'm enthusiast in both these fields. And I just want to know, how are we to bury this dead? If it is dead, then we have some common ground, some rituals on how we bury the dead. Or are we at any risk of producing any Frankenstein? Thank you.
There's a interesting comment, and I think, I don't know where he says this. It might be in one of the text collections. He says at one point, philosophy seems to be really in the mood to constantly tell itself, it's over, it's just, forget about it, right? But then there's a theory conference about philosophy and people come, right? So the world needs philosophy. It's what it constantly tells the philosophers, right? And philosophy should, that's I think Badiou's position, sometimes maybe just assume that and learn from the world that it's, but I mean, without simply becoming optimistic or whatsoever, but right, breaking the habit of enjoying that this is all useless in the first place. So I think that would be my answer.
Okay, please join me in thanking Frank.